Hi guys, and welcome to U-Wrench. Today we're back working on the Grand Caravan. Same applies to the Chrysler Town and Country. And in this video we're going to show you how to change your grotty old rear shock absorber from this to this. Now before you start the job, it's important to realise that there are actually two different types of rear shocks that can be fitted onto your Grand Caravan or your Town and Country. Now the first type is what we have here, and this is commonly referred to as touring suspension or standard suspension. And the second type is commonly referred to as Nivomat or self-leveling. And as you may have guessed by the name, that type of shock has a self-leveling system built into it. And that system might be installed if you've got something like the optional tow package fitted to your vehicle. Now thankfully it's quite easy to identify between the two different types. So what we have here on the standard shock, you can see it's fairly chunky, but it's pretty much the size that you would expect to see for a rear shock. Whereas on the Nivomat, which are the self-leveling shocks, they are considerably chunkier than these. And so it's fairly easy to tell just by looking at them whether you have the standard or whether you have the self-leveling rear shocks. Now thankfully the method for replacing the rear shock is the same regardless of whether you have the standard or the self-leveling suspension. However, what does make a big difference is the actual price of the shocks themselves. So to give you some kind of idea, on the standard shock here, the genuine ones are only around $80, but that is $80 per side, so you'd be looking at about $160 approximately for a pair of the genuine standard shocks. Whereas if you're on a tight budget and you're happy to go non-genuine, then you can pick up rear standard shocks, places like Amazon, for as low as $50 to $60, and that is for a pair. So it's about almost 1/3 of the price of the genuine ones. Whereas when it comes to the self-leveling Nivomat suspension, things become both more complicated and a lot more expensive. There are about 5 or 6 different types of genuine self-leveling shocks, and they vary depending on the size of the wheels, whether you've got heavy duty suspension, sports suspension and all that kind of thing. And the price on those genuine, depending on which one that you need, is going to set you back around $550 to $700 each side. So you're definitely looking well over $1,000 for a pair of the self-leveling genuine shocks. If you're happy to use non-genuine shocks, or your budget won't allow you to get the genuine ones, then you can buy them for about $700, and that is per pair, so about $350 per shock. For non-genuine ones with the self-leveling suspension. And what we'll do to make things easy for you, we will be adding Amazon links into the video description for the best deals available on both the standard and also for the Nivomat self-leveling shocks. So when you come to buy your shocks, if this video has been helpful for you, please help support us and be sure to use the links in the video description below. And another thing that's worth mentioning at this stage as well is it's generally good practice to replace your springs at the same time that you replace your shock. The reason for that being, if your spring is the same age as your shock, then it will have a similar amount of wear. So that spring will have been compressed a fair bit over time. When you put your brand new shock on there, instead of that shock being at its maximum travel, it will be slightly compressed due to the sag on the rear spring. So immediately you're putting extra wear onto your new shock. So that's the theory behind it, and it is good practice to replace the spring at the same time as your shock if your budget will allow. And with regards to springs, they're not very expensive at all. Aftermarket springs for the standard suspension around $75 per pair, and for the self-leveling they're about $85 a pair for the non-genuine. And again, we will add Amazon links for those into the video description below. And a quick thing to mention on the self-leveling suspension, if your budget's tight and you don't really fancy spending somewhere between $700 and $1,500 on a new pair of rear shocks, it's worth noting that you can downgrade the suspension from the self-leveling back down to the standard shocks. However, the rear springs are different. They have a different load rating between the standard suspension and the self-leveling. So if you are downgrading the shock, you definitely have to replace the spring at the same time. Also, I have a feeling you may well have to replace the mounts that the spring fits into as well if you are downgrading. But you will have to do your own research into that. That's not something we'll be covering in this video. but it is definitely possible to downgrade the rear shocks. So if your budget's tight and you prefer to spend $50 or $60 on these shocks rather than $1,000 plus, then it's definitely worth a little bit of your time just to do a little bit of Google research if that's of interest to you. So once you've identified what type of shock that you definitely need and you've ordered your replacements, it's time to crack on with the job. And these are the ones that we're going to be fitting here today. These were bought on Amazon, and these were $60 for the pair, only $30 each side. And again, you will find links for these in the video description below. And one very important thing to point out when it comes to your shocks, you must make sure that you always replace them on both sides of the car. So you're replacing a pair at a time. So for the replacement of the rear shock, it's actually a fairly simple job. And it's worth pointing out that you can actually leave your wheel on. However, we've removed the wheel here because it is a little bit easier, and of course we need access for the camera as well. So the way that it works is pretty simple. On our shock here we have an eye on the end, and going through the center of those eyes we have a bolt. So we've got a bolt here at the top, and likewise on the other end here, a bolt on the bottom. It's worth pointing out that we have nice easy access to our lower bolt here, and the bolt itself passes through in this direction and outward direction, and what we can see on the end here is actually the nut. Whereas when it comes to the upper bolt, we've definitely got far less access. And it's worth noting that this bolt passes from the outside in, so the nut is on the rear. So to help get us started, we're going to put some penetration fluid onto these fixings. And before we do that, if you have any corrosion or build-up, just grab yourself your wire brush and just give these a little bit of a clean up. Then grab your penetration spray. We're using Plus Gas here, but there's dozens of different brands for this, things like Liquid Wrench, and also WD-40 does a half decent job of this as well. And we're just going to put a little bit of this onto the end of these fixings. And if possible, just give that about 5 to 10 minutes, allow that to soak in. So the first thing that we need to do before we look at removing either of these bolts is we actually need to make sure that we support the axle. The reason being is our shock absorber here is acting as a brace between your upper frame and the axle down here. So when we disconnect the shock, then this is going to want to fall. So we need to make sure this is supported. And the ideal tool for this job, of course, would be a transmission jack, but we're assuming that you don't have one of those lying around at home. So we're going to use the DIY method, and we're going to brace this using a piece of timber. There's a nice little lip just under here. Get my timber in there. Make sure that's nice and supported. So we're going to start with our bolt here at the bottom first. Now we're not going to remove that bolt just yet, but we do need to get the nut removed. So this is a size 18 on both sides, and you need to counter hold on one side, ideally with a spanner, a wrench, something like that. Unfortunately the space is somewhat limited, as you can see in here, so it's not possible to get the head of a full-size wrench in there. And then you need to attack this side here either with a breaker bar, or ideally if you've got one, an air gun. And just for good practice, there's no way that this is going to slip out in reality. We're just going to pop the nut back on, just so that's ready for when we're going to be removing it later. Now when it comes to our top nut, which is obviously on the rear rather than on the front, you'll notice we've got these pipes right here. And unfortunately, if we take our standard size 18 spanner, we're really going to struggle to get that onto the end of that nut. If you get really stuck, there is a workaround, but it is a bit of a pain. You can actually undo the 4 bolts that hold this bracket on, but that's creating a lot of extra work. So is there a workaround that we can do where we don't have to remove this bracket? And this is the kind of job where a tool such as this comes in really, really handy. This is called an S-style spanner, as you can see, because of the shape of it, and because it's got those bends in it, that allows us to access these kind of locations. So as we can see, we can actually put that up on there, and we've got no problem getting that onto the back of the nut. So a tool like that really can save you a massive headache. And they do another variation of this type of spanner, which is this one here. As you can see on this one, both of the bends go in the same direction, and this is called a moon spanner. And you can pick both of these up relatively inexpensively, and we will be adding some links to the best deals that you can get on these on Amazon, and we will add those into the video description below. So again, if you need these, please help support us and check out those links. Okay, let's get our spanner set up first of all. And you want to make sure, especially if there's corrosion on the nut, that you're pushing it all the way in. What you don't want to do is have it quite shallow, because you want to make sure we're not going to have any possibility of rounding that nut off. You want to make sure you get that in as deep as you possibly can onto that nut. So now we want to completely remove our lower bolt, which hasn't moved, so we can just take the nut back off. And there you go, there's not much pressure on there at all. Do that by hand. If you can't do that by hand, you can always unscrew it, either using the impact gun or a wrench. This one doesn't have much pressure on it at all. And now you can give this a bit of a wobble. It should be fairly easy to remove the top bolt as well. It's always a good idea with your new shock absorber, because they're generally stored on their side, it's a good idea to prime these before installation. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to push this down. That will allow me to remove the band, and then I'm going to let it come all the way back up, and then I'm going to push it back down as far as I can, let it come back up, push it down again. We need to do that two to three times. Now you take the new shock, and I'm going to put the top bolt in first. Just get that aligned. So now I want to get the nut started on the other end. They can be a little bit tricky, but just remember, if you need to kind of manipulate the bolt to make it a little bit easier for you, you can just wobble the shock, move it backwards and forwards as you need to. So next we're going to do exactly the same with our lower bolt. Remember that the orientation is from the inside out. So the head of the bolt should be on the inside of the car, and the end here will be on the wheel side. Now this is not always the case. Often you'll find that these fit either perfectly, or they might be a slightly bit too long, and you can just kind of push them back by hand. But as you can see, we come up a little bit short, which is our worst case scenario. But it's not the end of the world. We'll show you exactly what to do if you end up with this same issue. So what we need to do is we actually need to lift our axle up just a little bit, so we need to put a tiny bit of pressure on there. We only need to move it about this much just to get the alignment here. Now we've currently got our brace in here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an extra piece of wood in under here. I'm going to put a jack underneath that, and we're just going to lightly jack that up just so we get the enough clearance just to get that bolt in. You can see it's fairly easy to move, doesn't take a lot. Almost there. Just make sure my original ones don't fall out. And that should be about it there. So I've just gone a tiny bit too high. It looks good on this side, but it's a little bit off on the rear. So I'm going to bring it back down a little bit, make sure I've got my original strut ready to support it as I bring this down just a touch. So a little bit of fine tuning, just moving it a tiny bit each time. You should find, after doing it 3 or 4 times, you should find the perfect alignment. And then pop our nut back on, start getting that tightened up. So now we just need to start getting this tightened up. Now remember, we don't really have enough access to this, so I'm going to use my spanner again. And get a wrench on the other side. And just start to tighten this up. And don't over tighten it at this stage, just tighten it up so you've taken all of the air movement out of it. And we'll torque this up to a specification a little bit further down the line. And then we need to do exactly the same on our second bolt. Again, just take all the movement out of the bolt, get it snugged up, but don't over tighten it. We'll do it to a proper torque specification with a torque wrench in a short while. So next up, we need to get these torqued up to the correct factory specification. When it comes to this, there is a very small complication. To do it via the workshop manual, which to be honest is also kind of the best practice way of doing it, what you're meant to do is you're meant to do it with the shock under compression. So what that means in reality is the wheel will go back on, you lower the car back down to the floor, and so when the shock is in a compressed state, then you would tighten up these two bolts, top and bottom, to the correct spec. And if you have a 4-post lift, that's very easy to do because you can lower that car down, you can still come on the inside of the car and work very easily, and you have pretty decent access to these fixings. However, in the real world, especially if you are doing this as a DIY job, it is just not practical. There's no way that you can lower a Grand Caravan down to the floor. The clearance is very, very low on these vehicles, and you're not going to be able to climb underneath with the car lowered down and start messing with these fixings to get them up to correct spec. So the real world way of doing these is you're going to torque them up in this position. So yes, it's not the best practice to do it this way, but in reality it's the only practical solution in most instances. And so these are 75 Newton meters, which is 55 foot-pounds. And of course we're going to repeat that at the top, 75 Newton meters once again, 55 foot-pounds. And then you can take your brace out. And of course if you needed to raise yours like we did to get the alignment, now you can drop it down. So that's our first shock replaced, and remember of course these always should be replaced in pairs. So we're going to shoot around to the other side of the car. The process obviously is exactly the same as what you've just seen here. The main thing that we're going to point out to you, there are a couple of differences up around the top. We've got a couple of brake lines up there that we need to be careful of. So here on the opposite side of the vehicle, this is the left side of the vehicle, or a driver's side. What we have here is we have these two brake lines that disappear in behind the mount, and our nut for our upper bolt is just there, and you'll feel this for yourself when you put your finger up there. It's actually very, very close, this kind of distance maybe between where the bolt's going to come off, the nut's going to come off, and these brake lines. So we've got to be very careful with this nut as it moves backwards off of the bolt, that it doesn't go into these brake lines, because obviously you don't want to crush or deform the brake lines. In your worst case scenario, if you feel it getting a little bit too close, then what you can do is once you've slackened it off a little bit, you can try and pull the head of this through and then try and undo it with a manual wrench from there. But whatever you do, just remember to keep an eye on the gap between the nut there and the brake lines. So there we go, that's job done. As promised, it's not too bad a job to do at all. And as you can see, we've got our nice fresh shock in place. So thank you for watching, and before you leave us, can we ask one quick favour? Can you take 1 second out of your busy day just to hit that like button for us? It really does help out our channel and would be much appreciated. Likewise, please consider subscribing. We've got loads more great Grand Caravan and Town and Country DIY videos on our YouTube channel waiting for you to check out. So thank you again, we'll see you on the next video.